Welcome to 2016. This is the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. This is the last of our series of Winter Why Nots. In the second half, we talked to Charles Hugh Smith about his ideas to improve our economic world. But now Stacey and I are going to discuss the big themes we see ahead for 2016. Stacey.
Max, the big themes of our Winter Why Nots were, of course, that wealth and income gap, the absence of meaningful jobs anymore or wealth creation, and of course debt and the notion of money and how to build our infrastructures, build our economies in a way that is sustainable. So my first headline, I want to look at the average American worker earns less today than 40 years ago. And this has been the biggest theme of the past few decades, well, since it started breaking off. Of course, we went off the gold standard in 1971, and up until that point, pretty much workers' income rose along with productivity. Productivity is real wealth. It's how much you produce per hour worked. You want that to rise. You want the average worker to produce more and more and more, and also be compensated for it. In the post-World War II era, when there was a new agreement between all the classes of society, we were seeing workers' wages rise. But it's remarkable how productivity continued to rise, and that's flattening and even decreasing in places like the UK, as hourly wages, compensation barely increased. And that's the big story. It's coming to a head. I think maybe 2016 could be it.
Well, there's been a swap of productivity for leisure. So, for example, if somebody goes on a TV watching binge and watches a TV show for 10 hours, 20 hours, 30 hours, a whole series or multiple series, they're swapping productivity for leisure. Now, this is possible because the cost in the digital realm of technological processing, technological storage, technological programming or CPUs or processing has dropped down towards zero. So even though wages have been dropping, the cost of technological leisure has been dropping even faster. So people haven't noticed that their productivity and their wages and their wealth has been diverging from those who offer the technological leisure at the very tippity top of the pyramid. Now, I think in 2016, we're going to see a collision of these forces, that the leisure time will be rejected. People will say, you know what, I'm tired of binge watching Netflix. I want a job. And this will cause an insurrection of a particular type.
Well, I mean, the productivity in the UK, for example, is 20% below France, where in France the incomes are higher. Here, incomes are lower. There's more disposable, zero-hour contract working sort of job environment. In the United States, you also have very low incomes amongst retail sector, Walmart, all those sort of things. And one of the arguments is that if the price of the labor is higher, actually corporations would become more efficient. They would want to grab more productivity out of those workers, but because they're just disposable, that they barely cost anything relative to the incomes of the executive class.
Well, my theory explains the French conundrum, because most quality television is in English, not in French. If France started creating binge-watching worthy television like Breaking Bad in French, then the French productivity numbers would crash as well. But because they don't have 20 hours of Breaking Bad to watch in French, they work, and as a result, their productivity is higher.
Now, another big story I want to look at is, this is a chart I saw in an article, Should We Be Worried After Years of Improvement? Fuel economy has hit a new plateau in U.S. I almost said chateau.
Ah oui, on habite Château, Provence.
So here's adjusted fuel economy from 1975 to 2011. As you see, the price of oil skyrocketed during the 70s, during the oil embargo days, and we saw fuel efficiency as a result increase in cars because people wanted more efficient cars, vehicles. They didn't want to spend, or they couldn't even spend, the money required to drive from point A to point B, especially because back in those days you could only go to the gas station, the petrol station, every other day.
Yeah, well, you had your odd license number plates and even number license plates. That's how they divided it up. I remember those days very well.
Yes, and then through the 80s, it actually declined. Our fuel efficiency declined, and then it rose a little bit thanks to the oil price increases, and then has now begun to decline again. So this inefficiency in fuel consumption makes no sense in a capitalist system. You should want to always be more and more efficient. Instead, we've become less and less efficient. And this brings me to the story. At the end of the year, we saw COP21 and this notion of a post-carbon economy, where we saw we heard the words. We're saying we're going to become more efficient, reduce consumption of carbon and all that stuff. But what we saw in action at the end of the year is, in the UK, for example, they increased fracking. They slashed subsidies for renewable energies. So I bring to this headline, even if the global warming scare were a hoax, we would still need it. China is the low carbon superpower and will be the ultimate enforcer of the COP21 climate deal in Paris. So this is Ambrose Evans Pritchard in The Telegraph, and he argues that, a lot of people say, oh, we shouldn't have any sort of global agreement about carbon emissions because China uses so much carbon, and they're going to continue to use carbon, and they'll never cut back on coal. But what he says is 8 of the world's biggest solar companies are Chinese. So is the second biggest wind power group, Goldwind. China invested $90 billion in renewable energy last year and is already the superpower of low carbon industries. It installed more solar in the first quarter than currently exist in France. The Chinese plan to build 6 to 8 nuclear power plants every year, reaching 110 by 2030. They intend to lever this into worldwide nuclear dominance, as we glimpsed from the Hinkley Point saga. So, of course, Hinkley Point saga being in 2015 in the UK. The UK is building a new nuclear power plant in Hinkley Point, Somerset. And not the UK government, not any UK corporation, instead EDF, which is French state-owned, is building it with China Group, which is another state-owned project. So they're building the nuclear power plant here. China has a plan to go completely renewable by 2030 because they don't want to rely on, they want to be post-carbon because their own studies show that the Himalayas are melting rapidly, which will disrupt their own economy, and temperatures have already risen there by 1 degree Celsius.
Right, the exponential efficiency quantum leaps forward for renewables, solar and wind, are putting enormous strain on the industrial military complex, which has been put in place for the past 40 years to support the oil industry. So a lot of the arms that are sold around the world are sold to bomb countries to keep this oilized, militarized,
and
dollarized
yeah.
world order in place. So renewables, just the same way that software industry has transformed business dramatically and permanently because of the cost dropping down to near zero, the asymptotic curve, to put it in mathematical terms. This is now coming to renewables. And yeah, if China becomes a renewable superpower, they have the ability to enforce this type of global carbon reduction scheme. And let's not forget that this is one reason why the junk bond market in the oil sector might not ever come back, because that whole industry is being completely reshaped.
Exactly, because let's look at the cost, actually. One of the arguments 5-10 years ago was the shrieking argument, that renewables cost so much more than oil and gas. Shriek, shriek, shriek. Well, the average cost of global solar was $400 a megawatt hour worldwide in 2010. It fell to $130 in 2014 and now has fallen below $60 in the best locations. Almost nobody could have imagined this 6 years ago, said Mark Lewis from Barclays. So solar has collapsed because of technology and increased efficiency and production and R&D in China. But also, China installed a record 23 gigawatts of wind power in 2014. It did so because wind is quick and cheap. Lazard calculates that the levelized cost of unsubsidized onshore wind has dropped 61% globally thanks to smart software, better blades, and higher turbines that catch the sweet spot. It thinks wind now undercuts coal and gas, and by a wide margin in optimal spots. So already in China, it's actually cheaper, specifically in areas like Jilin, Jingzhou, and Zhejiang, where it's cheaper to use wind than coal.
Absolutely. I mean, it's foolish to say nobody saw this coming 6 or 7 years ago. Renewables, photoelectric cells, wind energy, obviously, when you're talking about engineering and digital engineering, you have every 18 months a reduction or halving, cut in half, the cost. We've seen this, for decades now, and now it's being applied to solar and wind energy and other renewables. Oil is an analog industry. You take, big heavy machinery and you pull oil out. There's no way you can digitize that.
No.
But with solar and wind, yes, you can digitize that. That's why you've got the cost of solar and wind being cut in half every 18 months, but the cost of traditional oil extraction and energy and fracking is doubling because of the illiquidity, the junk bond market collapse, and all those other forces.
So not a single shriek happened in China. Instead, they just did. They acted and they did. And this is a part of the theme of a new empire emerging. The shriekers tend to be the empire falling apart. Britain did it when they were falling apart. They shrieked and caused all sort of mayhem and chaos around the world. And finally, tying this into the collapsing empire and debt, the notion of debt, Michael Hudson, the IMF changes its rules to isolate China and Russia. So apparently, December 8th, 2015 is a day that we saw Jerry Rice, the spokesman for the IMF, announce that the IMF's executive board met today and agreed to change the current policy on non-toleration of arrears to official creditors. The creditor leverage that the IMF has used is that if a nation has financial arrears to any government, it cannot qualify for an IMF loan and hence for packages involving other governments. This has been the system by which the dollarized global financial system has worked for half a century. The beneficiaries have been creditors in US dollars. The IMF changed this law. They now allow states, nations to default on sovereign debt. Partly it was as a strategic thing to allow Ukraine to default to Russia, but primarily it's about the AIIB Bank and China, so the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, and China has been lending money to Africa, Latin America, and the U.S. has not liked this, according to Michael Hudson. And what they want is now that they'll be able to, use all of China's money, borrow all the money you want. We're going to go to them, say, hey, why don't you just don't pay China back, and then come to the IMF.
Right. Had they done this 6 months earlier, Greece could have defaulted.
True.
And they would not have gone through the collapse that they've gone through. IMF essentially assisting in the euthanization of Greece. Stacey, we got to go. Thanks for so much. Again, got to go.
Why not go to the second half with Charles Hugh Smith?
Yeah, let's go to the second half with Charles Hugh Smith on this, the Winter Why Nots. Hi, I'm Max Kaiser. I'm here with Stacey Herbert. Welcome to this special Winter Why Not episode of Kaiser Report, a series in which we ask experts, thinkers, interesting people to suggest some radical ideas to get us out of the economic and debt nightmare from which we seem unable to awaken. Today, why not a radically beneficial world with Charles Hugh Smith of twominds.com and author of a new book, A Radically Beneficial Future. Charles, welcome back to the Kaiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Always a pleasure.
All right, Charles, let's begin with the simple question here. Why not a radically beneficial world? What is your basic proposal?
Okay, Max, it seems to me that what the current arrangement of central states and the corporatocracy, their whole idea is let's create money by borrowing it into existence and then giving it to the top of the wealth pyramid. And then this is somehow supposed to magically trickle down to the masses. And if there's no work because of automation or other things, well, then we're going to just pay you basically welfare, and you're supposed to be grateful for that. My idea is why don't we create paid work for everybody instead of minimal welfare.
So let's talk about that further, because you think that money creation, the way we create the money now, is at the heart of the global economic malaise. You say that because there's no connection between money creation and actually job creation, that this is the problem. Why is that a problem, and what is your solution to making money related to job creation?
Okay, so right now we borrow money into existence, as all your listeners know, and it flows from central banks and the too big to fail banks, which are at the top of our wealth pyramid. So we're creating money at the top and distributing it at the top. My proposal is let's create money that's not borrowed into existence. We just create it like a cryptocurrency, like Bitcoin is created, and let's distribute it at the bottom of the wealth pyramid to people who could actually do useful work in their own communities.
Well, but Charles, if we were to do that, we would be removing one of the biggest profit generators in the history of economics, and that is war. By continually putting people into debt and by having countries in debt and individuals in debt, you lay the groundwork for perpetual warfare. And warfare is basically welfare for the top 1/10 of 1%. It's hugely profitable. It keeps everybody on total state of panic. And with whether it's the war on terrorism, the war on drugs, or the war on whomever, it's all funded by keeping everyone perpetually in debt. So war is profitable. You know, you're asking people to stop engaging in the most profitable enterprise in the history of society, Charles.
Granted, and then we can also say I'm also suggesting we don't need banks, which is the second most profitable enterprise in human history. So yes, it does appear to be pie in the sky, if you will. But I think that as periphery nations, emerging nations enter into various crises, not just from war, but from the destruction of their currency and the disruption of the current arrangement, if you will, that there will be openings for new currencies like Bitcoin and new economic arrangements. And so the proposal I make is I see it as augmenting the current system. It doesn't necessarily replace for-profit corporations or the government, but it augments the current arrangement where it's needed, which is we have no community economy left.
So, Charles, though, if your proposal is that money creation is tied to paying workers, you create money to pay workers, what if there are no jobs? We have the automation taking away jobs. We have jobs have been exported to China. What if there are no jobs? Then obviously you're going to have massive deflation. That's part of the reason why we do have massive deflation. We've had the credit creation, which has fed the banks, which has fed the major corporations, which have a record stockpile of cash. In fact, when the ECB recently cut rates to negative 0.3%, small and medium-sized enterprises said, we already have enough access to credit. We don't need any more credit. What we need is people to have money because they can't buy our products. So what if there are no jobs?
Well, that's an excellent question, Stacy. And my answer starts with we need to make a distinction between profitable work and useful work. And that distinction is completely lost in the current arrangement. And so if we think about a community, we can think of a lot of different work that's not being done, and it's not being done because it's not profitable by corporations. And say, for instance, dedicated bikeways. Now, these may be common in European countries, but as you know, in the US, there's very few bikeways, and most of them are unsafe. You're sharing a highway. And so this work will never be profitable. This is one example of hundreds of kinds of useful work that could be done and organized by the community. And so if we no longer have to make a profit off of the work, well, then a whole universe of work appears.
How about this? The individual agreed. In New York, we had the building of the High Line over in the former meatpacking district up to Hell's Kitchen. And at the time, when it cost something like $1 billion to build, and most of the taxpayers of New York were adamantly against this. However, it's driven the entire proliferation of all sorts of new luxury flats, amazing restaurants. Property prices went up for all those who lived there. Now, there's a plan to build the entirety of Broadway between Union Square and up near Central Park. I forget the name of the circle there. But they want to build that entire thing into a park, all of Broadway, because the taxpayers who own the property there are very happy with all of the income that has been derived because of the unprofitable, otherwise High Line, which has now actually turned out to be very profitable, not for corporations, but for the individuals living in New York City.
Yes, Stacy, that brings up this whole issue of how do we benefit from the broadly based, like say, social capital? In other words, in the communities and political structures that we live in, how do individuals benefit from that shared capital? And so my proposal is, why not create a different new system for aggregating capital within local communities? And of course, New York City is a very large community, but it's made up of neighborhoods. And so my proposal would be, if we created a way for work and capital to be aggregated in local communities, then people might have some alternative to basically betting their lives on these large centralized hierarchies.
Well, look, Charles, there's an interesting dynamic in play here. Those with a lot of wealth feel very insecure, and they try to insulate themselves from risk. And in doing so, they're pulling capital out of the economy. We saw this after 9/11. After 9/11, the top 1,000 or 2,000 families in the world felt like they were under attack. So they went ahead and they drained the financial systems of trillions of dollars to build themselves insulating bunkers, to put themselves behind firewalls, to start aggregating more ways to shelter themselves from the day-to-day realities of life. Is there a way to bring risk back so that having wealth doesn't mean that you're completely outside of the realm of risk? Can we bring something in like a Hunger Games for the top 1/10%, where every year or so, if you have $1 billion, you may just end up being thrown off a cliff? In other words, you have risk. There's risk with being wealthy, because right now there's a mad dash to protect yourself from all risk. And as you protect yourself from all risk, everybody else ends up living in a world full of extreme risk. So my victim as a terrorist victim is because some rich guy has protected themselves from all risks of life. What about something like this, a Hunger Games for those people we hate at the very tippity top?
Well, I'm all in favor of entertainment, and that would be very useful entertainment. I think my system is, I'm looking at, why not create more positive social roles for everyone who's been marginalized. Now, we may not be able to pull those super wealthy people out of their bunkers, but I would just say, let's ignore them, because they're not going to help the planet or the rest of us. So we're going to have to help ourselves. And what we're really lacking is paid income and social capital at the local decentralized level, and positive social roles. Like
okay, so how to create this? Because we've had people on who talked about basic income. You don't believe in basic income. This is how is this? How are these paid roles created? Is it forced or is it voluntary? Is it through taxes? Is it through crowdfunding? How does this happen?
Well, my system proposes a new currency, which is created, a cryptocurrency, which is created when somebody does useful work in their community. In other words, it's a labor-backed community and a labor-backed currency, if you will. So it's created out of thin air, like Bitcoin or like US dollars. But unlike US dollars, it's not borrowed into existence. So it doesn't require taxation, and it doesn't require interest payments on that new money. And I think that you guys are highly attuned to the potential of cryptocurrencies. And so I'm basically taking cryptocurrencies and tying it into creating paid work in the communities, who get to decide how to do their work. And it's entirely voluntary.
I saw there's actually a currency called BitWalk or something like that, where they actually are using paying people with a currency who walk. The more you walk in the day, the more of this currency you receive. So it's something similar to that.
Yes, and with the idea that it's actually a global currency, so each of these communities can trade and have commerce with other community groups without needing to access the current system of money borrowed into existence. And a lot of people think, well, this is impossible. It doesn't work because what's the money backed with? Well, it's backed by the goods and services that have been created in the local communities. And I realize this is a very new idea. It doesn't really jive with the current arrangement. But I think if we think it through, we realize it's entirely possible. I mean, humans have used shells and notch sticks and all kinds of other things.
So, Charles, what about a country like Greece that is really at the end of its tether? and has already talked about introducing a parallel currency. Why don't they just tell the EU and the Troika, forget it, we're introducing a coin backed by labor, it's a crypto coin, and we're going to start fresh?
I think that's an excellent idea, Max, and it would immediately have value because it can't be created in trillions by some central bank.
All right, well, fair enough. Charles Hugh Smith, thanks so much for being on this special Why Not Winter Why Not episode of the Kaiser Report.
Thank you so much, and why not?
Why not?
Good question.
Well, that's going to do it for this Kaiser Report's Winter Why Not segment on a radically beneficial world with me, Max Kaiser, Stacey Herbert, and our guest, Charles Hugh Smith of TwoMinds.com. If you'd like to send us your thoughts on this episode, tweet us at Kaiser Report. Until next time, why not?